In this lesson, you will learn to graph linear inequalities and systems of inequalities. Now, when you graph a linear inequality, you're going to graph the same way that you would an equation. The only difference is with the line, we're going to have either a dotted line or a solid line, and then we're also going to be shading in either above or below that line. So for example, here we have y is less than negative x plus 1. Now when you begin graphing an inequality, you're going to start out the same way as graphing an equation. So we know how to graph y equals negative x plus 1 because negative 1 would be your slope. This is the number with the x. So negative 1 is your slope. Your y-intercept would be the 1, the plus 1. And so when I graph this, graphing the equation, I know that because my y-intercept is 1, I can go up 1 to find 1 point. And the slope is negative 1. So if I use the fact that this is rise over run, I can see that negative 1 would be the same thing as negative 1 over 1. So rise would be negative 1, so down 1 from that point, and the run is positive 1, so I go to the right 1. So from this point, I'm going to go down 1 and to the right 1 to get that point right there. And now I'm going to draw the line. And then because it is less than means the numbers will be smaller. So it's saying y is smaller than this line right here. So where does y get smaller? Well, y gets smaller as it goes down lower on this y-axis. So when it says y is less than negative x plus 1, I'm going to shade in everywhere where y is smaller than this line. Well, where is y smaller than the line? It's going to be below. So I'm going to shade in everything below. So the shading is the one part that is going to be different with an inequality. The other part is the fact that with less than or greater than, that does not actually include the line itself. So notice how this line is dotted. It's kind of hard to tell maybe on this screen, but this is a dotted line. And it's dotted to represent the fact that this inequality does not include the line. So if it were less than or equal to, it would be a solid line because it could be equal to that line. But because it's not, it's just less than, it's going to be a dotted line. So if it is greater than or less than, that would be a dotted line because it's not equal to that line. And that's kind of analogous to when you graph with one variable, because when you graph with one variable, say you had x is greater than 4, it does not include 4, so it would be like an open circle at 4. So the open circle, when you graph on a number line, is analogous to the dotted line here with greater than or less than. And then if you have the equal sign included, then it's going to be a solid line. And that's analogous to the same thing with one variable, where with one variable, if it was x is greater than or equal to 4, for example, because it has the equal sign as part of it, it's going to be a closed circle. So there is comparison to one variable and two variables, and this might help you with remembering when to use the dotted and when to use the solid. And the other difference is going to be the shading. So how do you know when to shade below or above? Well, if it's greater than or equal to, it's going to be shading in above because the numbers are bigger above the line. And that's kind of analogous to shading into the right with a one variable. So if it was like x, if x is greater than 3, it's going to be open circle shading into the right. Well, the shading into the right is analogous to shading above for the greater than. And then if it's less than or equal to, then you would shade below, like we see in this example. And that's analogous to shading into the left with one variable. If you had just x is less than or equal to 3, then be a closed circle shaded to the left. Okay, so there is comparison with 1 and 2 variables, and that is maybe a way that you can remember when to use which. Let's look at some other examples just to make sure that we understand. Here is one, same inequality. The only difference is instead of less than, we have a greater than sign. So the graph will be the same. It's going to be a dotted line because it's just greater than, not greater than or equal to. And then in this case, you're going to be shading in above because of the greater than sign. Okay, and then using the same inequality again, I'm going to skip over the graphing of the line because we know how to get to that point. But notice, because of the equal sign as part of this inequality, it's going to be a solid line right here. So a solid line because it's got the equal sign, and then you're going to shade in below because it is less than. So we'd have that graph right there. And then if it was greater than or equal to, same inequality, just the symbol is changed. So the line will still be the same. Notice it's solid line because of the equal sign as part of the inequality. And then the greater than means I'm going to shade in above that line. So my graph would look like this. Now here's another example. And here we have y is greater than or equal to 2. And once again, we can begin graphing this the same way that we'd graph an equation. So how would we graph y equals 2? Well, remember, when it's y equals, we first off could think of this as y equals 0x plus 2, where this may be easier to see the fact that there is an x component, but it's not written. It's an assumed 0 because there is no x written. And what we have here is the slope is going to be 0, and the y-intercept would be 2. So when you graph this, you're going to go up 2 to the y-intercept, and the slope is 0, meaning it's going to be a horizontal line. Okay, and if you don't want to think through it that way, that's fine. You could just look at the fact you have y equals 2 and realize that no matter what x is equal to, y would always be 2. X could be 1, x could be 0, x could be, whatever. Y would always be 2, which would create this horizontal line. Either way, we get the same line. And now we need to determine, is it going to be a solid line or a dotted line? And then where do we shade? So because it has the equal component, it's a greater than or equal to sign, it's going to be a solid line. And then the shading would be above because it is greater than. Y is bigger, up higher on the graph. So we're going to shade in above that line. Now if we have the same inequality, just change it to a less than or equal to. You're going to have the same line, and then instead you're going to shade in below because it is less than or equal to. Y is smaller as you go down the graph. Same inequality, just with a less than sign instead of the equal component. So we have the same line. The only difference is it's going to be a dotted line. And it may be difficult to see on the slide, but that's a dotted line. And the shading is less than, so it's going to be below. And that would be your graph. And then if it were y is greater than 2, once again a dotted line at 2 because of it just being a greater than sign. There's no equal component. And the shading would be above that line because it is greater than. Another example that is similar to the previous example would be x is less than 4. So here, instead of y, you have an x. And the concept is still the same, where I can think of this to begin graphing, think of this as x equals 4. Because if x is equal to 4, we know how to graph that. It's not in slope-intercept form, and there is really no slope, nothing with the x term, and it's kind of a weird one, but the concept is if we have 2 points, we can graph the line. And here, if x is 4, the question is, what is y equal to? Well, y can be anything, right? Y can be, if x were 4, y could be 2. If x were 4, y can be 0. It doesn't matter what y is equal to, x will always be 4. So when I graph this, I have points that I can plug in. I have 4, 2, or I have 4, 0. 4, comma, anything would be a point on the line. So if I were to graph that, it'd be over 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, up 0, and then 4, up 2. Notice we have a vertical line there at 4. My line is vertical. That's going to be where I begin. And the question is going to be, do I have a dotted or a solid line? And then do I shade? I guess where do I shade in this one? Well, because it is less than and not less than or equal to, it's going to be a dotted line. So if we're less than or equal to, it'd be a solid line. Now the shading for this one is a little different because we're not going to shade in above or below, because you cannot shade above or below, right? So the only parts we have is going to be to the left or to the right to shade in. Well, where is x smaller than 4? Well, if x were 3, that's smaller than 4. If x is 2, that's smaller than 4. Anything to the left of this line would be smaller than 4. So my shading would be over here on the left. Now for x is greater than 4, it'd be the dotted line still there at 4. But here, because it's greater than, we'd shade in to the right, because those numbers to the right is where x are bigger. And then if you had the equal component, so less than or equal to, it'd be a solid line at 4, and then less than would be shading to the left. And then if you had x is greater than or equal to 4, it's going to be a solid line again because it has an equal sign. So solid line at 4, and then shading to the right because it is greater than.